the world's attention has been in Ukraine. There has been an outcry of the hardship, the terror, the trauma that the citizens of Ukraine are going through in fleeing by the hundreds of thousands into Poland and other countries, trying to get into Western Europe. But as a black man who is conscious of his identity and sensitive to geopolitics and the global condition of people of African descent and the persistent discrimination that we face, my primary concern must be the African people who are there in the Ukraine. And there has been and continues to be a bitter, blatant racism against African people that it is our responsibility to dismantle and analyze and look at the root of it and go back to a few decades ago when there were structures of racist organizations that were established in that country that it seems that we're seeing the tone and character and spirit of today. So African people are being denied transport onto the evacuation trains and buses getting out of Ukraine. They're being treated like second and third class citizens out of that country. There are numerous reports of our people being discriminated against at a time when the whole world has lifted its sensitivity levels of humanity and compassion towards the people in that country. How is it that in the midst of all of that, they can still not care about the value of black lives? So there's been direct, blatant, cruel, and unapologetic racism by the Ukrainian people at the borders among those who have been trying to flee the country. And news reporters and government officials, journalists, have shown their true colors and their feelings towards black people. There were reporters openly lamenting the fact that it was white people that were being killed. One Ukrainian political official expressed sorrow that the people who are dying have blonde hair and blue eyes. Another journalist, live on camera, was saying this is happening to these people. They're not from the Middle East and they're not from the third world. It's happening to Europeans, as if subconsciously or subliminally it's supposed to be happening to someone else. And a spotlight is being shone on all of these people who are speaking off the top of their head without even realizing the consequences of what they're saying. One European reporter, and many of them, making such layered statements. But the main irony of this is that the black people who are being discriminated against, as we're all usually always profiled and stereotyped, the Africans in the Ukraine are probably the cream of the crop of the entire Ukrainian society. They are fine, intelligent examples of upright citizens. Many of them are young scholars, junior scientists, university students studying medicine and engineering. And they're being treated like third or fourth class citizens, like they don't matter at all. And that chaos, even though it was reported on the mainstream Western media, it was a secondary story for them, but it's a primary story for us here on Knowledge is Power. So I raised the question before, what should be our opinion about this? Should we just wholesale adopt the attitude and the perspective of America and Europe when we have went over the history that Russia is one of those few European countries that never enslaved the black people, never went into Africa and conquered or tried to colonize? They were not part of the Berlin Conference in 1884, where, as they said in their literature, that they took a map of Africa and carved it up like a cake and shared it between the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Belgians, and the Germans. Russia wasn't involved in that. And so now we're set to give an opinion between two sides that both have a culture of genocide against populations. That's the beginning of European history. And so I want us to dismantle one major point. And that is that Russian President Vladimir Putin identified two objectives that he had regarding Ukraine. One, he said he wanted to demilitarize them. But second, he said he also wanted to denazify Ukraine. Let's look at that part. Because the demilitarized, we could understand. I have stayed in hotels in Detroit, in the United States, and on a high-rise floor, looked out the window and saw Windsor, Canada. And I remember years ago I made a video about you're watching the cars driving back and forth between Canada and America on the northern border, but when you go to the southern border with Mexico, it's barbed wire fence, it's big heavy wall, it's border patrol and military type individuals dressed up guarding and looking for anyone to capture. Totally different thing. But imagine if some socialist or communist country, maybe someone like China, were to set up a military base right there on the northern border of Canada in Windsor with 200 or 300 missiles pointing towards America. What do you think America would do? Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962? America saw it as a threat because the Soviets established a military base in Cuba, which was 90 miles away from the tip of Florida. And remember in 1983, they invaded Grenada out of the paranoid speculation because Cuban engineers were assisting in the building of the Maurice Bishop International Airport, that they felt they were building a missile base again to attack America. And on that premise, when President Ronald Reagan in the White House in 1983 addressed his country, he said, don't be fooled. This tiny tropical paradise of Grenada is planning an attack against us. And he used that to go in and invade tiny Grenada. So we see FIFA, the Football Association, has banned Russia from the World Cup because they invaded Ukraine, but I don't remember FIFA banning the United States of America from the World Cup after invading Iraq or Afghanistan or Grenada. So we understand the demilitarized part, but why would President Putin say that he wants to denazify the Ukraine? And how is it that Nazi Germany and the Jewish Holocaust and the genocide against the Jewish people is the #1 issue of sensitivity globally on social media? You will be banned instantly if you misrepresent the struggle and the suffering of the Jewish people. So how come he could say something like that and it just be swept under the rug and just blatantly ignored by so much of the Western media? But let's look at it. President Putin obviously was speaking of a particular history that the Ukraine has and that many parts of Europe have. Haven't you noticed when it's the European Football Cup and the different European nations get together to play and you go further Eastern Europe that there's racist chants against the black footballers, and now they've criminalized racism, so you have police investigations. Even England, after losing the UEFA finals in a penalty shootout to Italy in 2021, the rabid racism that came out by the hundreds of comments on social media. But when you walk through the major cities of London and Birmingham and Manchester and Liverpool, you don't really see that. In Paris, France, and in some of these major areas. So where is that sentiment coming from? And is it a bad objective if Putin wants to rid Ukraine of what he refers to as Nazism? But let's look. After World War II, you had two major Ukrainian liberation organizations. Now remember, going back to World War II, 1939 to 1945, Ukraine was not a country acknowledged at that time. They got back their independence almost 100 years later from when they got it the first time. They got it back in 1991. So during World War II, most of Ukraine was territory that was inside Poland and Russia, mainly Poland. But there was a movement inside the Ukraine to try to establish a separate state, a separate country for the Ukrainian people, and we understand that totally. And two organizations rose up. One was known as the UPA, the Ukrainian Liberation Army. And the other was the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals. Here they are, just like the Palestinians struggling for their human rights in Israel after their land was taken away from them. The Ukrainians started these liberation movements inside of Poland. At first they were welcomed and accepted, but it started to get hostile. So by the time World War II was over, you had these two militant, white supremacist organizations that wanted an ethnic Ukrainian, pure white country. Check it for yourself. The UPA, Ukrainian Liberation Army, and the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals. But even after World War II was over, they kept fighting against the Russians because Ukraine is a country that is largely divided into West and East by ideology. Just like Germany. After World War II, Germany became West Germany and East Germany. West Germany was more empathetic towards capitalism and a liberal economy and being part of the European Union, while East Germany was more communist and socialist and wanted to be part of the bloc of countries known as the Iron Curtain along with Russia. And then the Berlin Wall was right there in the capital city along the middle. So you had like a west side and an east side, just like in Turkey. It is said the western part of Turkey is more Christian, the eastern part of Turkey is more Muslim. Some see it as a dividing line, but that is how the Ukraine was. So Western Ukraine was more sympathetic towards being part of the European Union, being part of NATO, culturally incorporating and integrating themselves into the countries in the West, such as England, France, Spain, Germany, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, and Portugal. But the eastern side of the Ukraine was more empathetic towards a communist, socialist, Soviet kind of political culture. And just like in any country, there are citizens of both camps inside those societies who think along the lines of gravitating towards a different political culture. So in the Ukraine now, you had these white supremacist groups that were fighting for liberation. Western Ukraine, remember, was part of the forces that were fighting with Germany against the Soviets. So they were fighting with the Nazis. A lot of them had incorporated themselves into the Nazis. But coming up out of Poland, this struggle continued. And then these organizations, the Ukrainian Liberation Army, the UPA, and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals, they became more influential, more powerful. They massacred Polish citizens, killed up to 100,000. And they continued their fight against the Russians. And there were many, many casualties. But what happened after this was very interesting. Because they stayed as a force to reckon with, just like how the Ku Klux Klan in America came in 3 stages. It started off as this terrorist organization that would lynch and kill and hang a black man, and a group of white cowards would kill a black man on his own. And they would be known to ride on their horses with these white hoods and burn crosses. But the second manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan, as the cliche statement went, they traded in their white hoods and robes for suits and ties and judges' outfits, and they would sit in the courts. They would be elected into political office on the local government level. They would become businessmen and create a fraternity among themselves that became even more attractive to some of the white people who did not want to ride a horse with a hood and a gown. So likewise, with the Ukrainian Liberation Army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals, they stayed together, became more influential, continued to pursue their objectives for an independent Ukraine. And then with the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, 1989 going into 1990, and then the fall of communism and all of these communist countries, formerly East Germany and Poland and Bulgaria and Hungary and Romania, and all of them one by one toppling. Ukraine got back their independence in 1991, and then those militant white supremacist racist organizations became known as Azov. Don't take my word for any of this. Do your own research on it. Today, Azov is a Ukrainian white supremacist, racist militia organization that is continuing their objective of wanting to keep Ukraine white, to establish an ethnic Ukrainian white state. They are directly, not partially, directly influenced by the Nazi Party. Look at their symbol. Really, it's just one stroke missing going up and one stroke missing coming down. But this is who they are. And they proudly wear their symbol, it's their logo, it's all over the Ukraine. But look at this. And you see, the real punchline is coming in just a couple minutes. This is not from the 1940s and the 1950s, with this militia that wanted to create a separate Ukrainian state. They achieved that in 1991, but they stayed together, continued to yield their influence. Note the unity between Azov and the Nazi Party. Look at how they've incorporated the Nazi flag, the perpetrators of the Holocaust, with the Ukrainian colors. But this is the part that's going to hit you. Because when we look at the year 2014, when there was a referendum in the Ukraine to become part of the European Union, the people on the western side of Ukraine in particular wanted to unify with Western Europe and join NATO, and the government at the time said, yes, we're for it, but then they pulled back. And when they pulled back, there were mass riots, mass protests in the street, mass unrest, and the militia came out. But something very significant happened in 2014. Look. In 2014, Azov gained attention after allegations of torture and war crimes, as well as neo-Nazi sympathies and usage of associated Nazi symbols such as the Wolf's Angel, one of the original symbols used by the German Nazi 2nd SS Panzer Division. And representatives of the Azov Battalion say that the symbol is an abbreviation for the slogan Ukrainian for national idea and deny a connection with the Nazis. But you could see for yourself. It saw its first combat experience recapturing Mariupol from pro-Russian separatists in June 2014. But on the 12th of November, 2014, Azov, a Nazi-type white supremacist racist militia organization, was incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine, and since then all members are official soldiers serving the government of the Ukraine in the National Guard. Use your brain. So you had this racist, white supremacist militia terrorizing, killed hundreds of thousands of Polish people in their struggle to get an independent Ukraine around the time of World War II, continued fighting against the Russians from way back then. And even after World War II was over, they kept fighting the Russians. And in 2014, with the unrest and the change of government, the new government that came in, literally said to Azov, you all are heroes, and deputized them as soldiers. So that is like the American government calling in the head of the Ku Klux Klan after terrorizing and traumatizing and murdering, lynching, killing black people. That's like the President of the United States inviting the Ku Klux Klan into the White House and telling them, listen, guys, I admire the work that y'all have been doing. We want to make you official soldiers in the United States Army. And so when President Putin says he wants to denazify the Ukraine, that is not something that the West should ignore. It's something that should be taken very seriously. A picture says 1,000 words. This is within the last 10 years. This is in recent times. That Azov, who are active up to today in 2022 in the Ukraine, were influenced and inspired by the white supremacist, racist Nazi party of Germany. Is that why there's such racism that no one expected, that hit everyone by surprise? Some people. Is that why there seems to be this deeply rooted sentiment in that society? Not just from the journalists, not just from the transportation workers, but also from the politicians, treating black people like second-class citizens in a life and death situation. Is that why they feel that way and are so blatantly racist against these beautiful, brilliant African students? Is it because of the roots of the Ukrainian Liberation Army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals, white supremacists that were fighting for a separate Ukrainian country, killing hundreds of thousands of ethnic Poles? And so they're against Russia. It's not like these Nazi white supremacists are supporting Russia. They're against Russia, but they are pro-European Union. They're pro-NATO. Just because they're against Russia, even though they're white supremacists, the West has taken a hands-off policy. But we'll see what the Jews will have to say about that. So, beloved, I'm going to run my first video for you, which is highlighting on the border of the Ukraine some of the tragic stories of the discrimination against African people.